Very excited to be able to present this information to you, which is obviously more relevant than ever, especially given what's going on internationally and here in the US. So we have with us here today Amy Thorndike, a lead CRA at Alira Health. My name is Chris Rao, VP of Clinical Development at Alira Health. First, we want to start off with a couple of housekeeping items and a couple of welcome items. So again, obviously, we'd like to offer our thanks to Scottish Development International, to Ricky Bavasso, who have sponsored this webinar with us here at Alira Health. We're very proud of our ongoing collaborative relationship with SDI. Obviously, they do really fantastic work with the Scottish team in terms of bringing innovative products within Scotland, and then also helping Scottish companies and companies in the area to bring their innovative research here to the US. So we're very proud of the collaboration we have with SDI and the ability to help Scottish companies and EU companies to come here to the US for their research goals. Just a couple of notes. So we do have a chat feature, a Q&A mode that's been enabled. You'll see that in the bottom right of your screen. So during the presentation, please do feel free to enter in questions. We'll have a short Q&A section after Amy's presentation where we can address any questions you have, clarify anything that pops up during the presentation by Amy, and then we'll have a small roundtable between Amy and I towards the end of the presentation. And obviously, if you have any questions, any connection issues, any technical issues, please feel free to enter those into the chat as well, and we can assist. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Amy Thorndike. Again, as I mentioned, Amy Thorndike is the lead CRA at Alira Health, based here on the East Coast, as am I in the Boston area here in the US. Amy helps lead our team of clinical research associates at Alira Health and is a senior member of the team, the research team here within Alira Health clinical CRO. So Amy, I'll turn it over to you and welcome to today's webinar.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks. I'm very happy to be here. Why don't we get started with the slide deck? So I'm going to give a little bit of background, or a small amount of background on remote monitoring, and then jump right into where we're at with COVID-19 and the many things that we all need to think about and be considering. Okay, so remote monitoring, it's not new. It's definitely been around. In my recollection, I actually started my career around the time that EDC systems began to be used, and sites or studies were really shifting from paper studies, paper case report forms, to using EDC systems and capturing that data electronically. And having the data captured electronically really allowed for just for more real-time review of the data, and also access to the data, from wherever. You didn't have to have a monitor to go on site to review those paper case report forms that were usually NCR paper, meaning like carbon paper, where they would actually take a sheet and then travel or send those via FedEx back in. We had systems now where everybody had, not everybody, but those people on the study teams, including CRAs and data managers and project managers, actually had access to the data in real time. Some of the pros, so that's kind of when the dawning of remote monitoring happened, or basically the conversation started saying, wow, we can really start doing things a little bit more remotely. We maybe don't have to go on site quite as frequently. And there's definitely pros to remote monitoring. It's less expensive. You can increase your visit volume. You have the ability to really identify much earlier any potential data issues or trends, because you can be doing that right from the beginning, right when a site starts entering data. You don't have, sometimes we wait 2 weeks to go on site to give the site some time to enter data. But with access to the data in an EDC system, somebody can start looking at the data as soon as it's being entered. It allows us to be more proactive and less reactive. Okay. However, there are some cons. Okay. Along with pros, there usually are some cons. Definitely more work for sites. So that would be if you transition more so into a remote monitoring type of monitoring plan, where you're not going on site. So beyond just looking at the data, monitors are source verifying the data. So they do need access to the source. So that's something that sites needed to figure out. How were they going to get the source? And that piece of getting the source to somebody who's not on site definitely created more work. Okay. From a monitoring standpoint, monitoring remotely does limit your ability to perform drug accountability. Okay. Drug accountability is one of those things that ideally is done on site. And then you introduce this possibility for missing medical records for SDV. Okay, so as a monitor, we're now relying on the site to get us everything. But from a remote standpoint, there's that uncertainty. Are we really getting everything? Are we really seeing everything? If they're primarily using an EMR system and we don't have access to it, and they're printing and certifying source and sending it to us, we don't have that ability to go into the EMR and really make sure they combed it the way a monitor would. When a monitor is given access to EMR, we're really looking at everything that's in there. And then there's also that risk of a loss of an in-person connection. So by not going on site, you're not establishing that in-person relationship. It's a remote relationship, primarily via the phone. What's nice now is we do at least have web conferencing available. I think back when remote monitoring and the EDC system use started, this type of interaction really wasn't available or wasn't commonly being used. So definitely back then, you had that loss of in-person connection because really everything was through the phone, through the EDC system, through queries in the EDC system, and through emails. Okay. So over time, so I would say it was back around 2004 when the industry really started using EDC platforms. Inform became popular. However, I wouldn't say that remote monitoring really caught on. Okay, I think the sites still really preferred to go on site. I think the monitors still really preferred to go on site if you think about the pros and the cons that I just spoke about. However, things became really different with COVID-19 when we were no longer, as monitors, allowed on sites. I can remember back when I was starting to get the phone calls from my CRAs the first week of March. So this would be here in the US, letting me know that they heard from their site that they were supposed to be going to next week that they can't come on site. We're not considered essential workers. So once that happened, that really caused us to really pivot quite quickly. For myself, it led me to think about, okay, how can we continue to do our jobs? How can we do this, do as close to as we would to on site? However, we're going to be doing it remotely. What do we need to have in place? Okay, so we really did have to quickly pivot. It happened really, really quickly. It was almost, for me, once we heard from one site, we were hearing from another site. We were starting to wonder, we still had some visits scheduled for maybe the second week of March. We moved into the second week of March. Then we heard from those sites that we couldn't come on site. So we definitely had to think quickly. And there were several steps that we had to take to really successfully implement remote monitoring across all of our sites. Okay. So we know that our sites typically host monitors in person. We had to pivot to identify how it was going to work at each site. There was a lot of information collection. We needed to find out, were some of these sites or were all of them using certain technologies that have become more popular? How are we going to collect information? We had to compile it. We had to evaluate it. We had some sites that we identified that it was really easy to transition them to a remote monitoring process because they were using the technologies. They were using a Florence system, which we'll talk about more. But basically, they had set up where we could electronically access their essential regulatory documents, which we haven't talked about. I've talked pretty much about data, but all of our sites have their essential regulatory documents, their investigator site file. As monitors, that is something we look at on site. We go through and check and make sure they have everything they're supposed to have. We make sure that it matches what we have in our files. So that was another piece, is how are we going to make sure that our sites are still maintaining their investigator site files appropriately? With some sites, that was already simple because they were maintaining them electronically and could give us access electronically. Another site that we found that was really easy to transition was a site that was using an EMR system that allowed remote EMR access for the monitors. So again, really simple. So a monitor really just needed a computer. We had some sites where simply a laptop with a login to the EMR, a login to the Florence system, and we were really good to go to conduct a monitoring visit from our home offices. Another thing, and then the other piece that we had to work on, aside from collecting all this information from sites and identifying what capabilities individual sites had, we also had to prepare and implement a remote monitoring plan. So, and this would be for any trial. So any of the trials that were ongoing coming into COVID-19 potentially didn't have a remote monitoring component in their monitoring plan. So we quickly did an addendum to our monitoring plan and basically outlined our process for remote monitoring. And this is really important for the FDA standpoint. So the FDA has come out with guidance for us. And one of the things that they talk about is documenting, and documentation has always been important, but especially when we pivoted to this COVID-19 remote monitoring piece, it was really important for us to get down in writing how we're doing what we're doing, what are the processes that we're following. And then last but certainly not least, communication. Okay, communication was really, communication is always important, but in this period of time where we were moving to a remote model, being in touch with our sites, communicating with them via the phone, communicating with them via video became just that much more important. And keeping the communication lines open and talking about, what are the struggles you're having? What's not working? Or this is what another site is doing. This may work at your site. So some of the sites had a more challenging time to transition to remote monitoring because they really weren't set up for it initially. So it was really important to work closely with those sites and to talk about and come up with strategies. And it was helpful, obviously, to be in touch with the sites that were making it work and finding out how they were making it work so that we could then share that information with the sites that maybe the transition wasn't coming quite so easily. Okay, so that transitions me into the site-specific variables, some of which I've already touched upon. So one of the first real site-specific variables that we had to drill down into for all of our sites is, well, what was the access to source going to look like? Okay, we're going to be remote monitoring. How can you get us the source? Remote EMR access was definitely the easiest or the quickest sort of transition. We had sites that we were supposed to go on site that first week of March. They let us know that we could not come on site, and we were actually able to pivot and transition to a remote monitoring visit still occurring within the month of March. And largely that was due to the ability for them to provide their monitor with remote EMR access. Okay. Another scenario for reviewing EMR, if the site can't provide remote EMR access, which is pretty common, they can do screen sharing. So basically, it's similar to the over-the-shoulder viewing of an EMR system. So there are sites where even when we're on site, their EMR system is not set up for monitor access, and we do need to do what's typically called an over-the-shoulder view of the EMR. And this is a similar over-the-shoulder view. It was just being done remotely through a screen sharing process. Some sites let us know that they had the ability to use e-binders. So again, this is almost similar to a shadow chart or a shadow binder. Many of our sites provide us source document worksheets within a patient-specific binder. Sites let us know that they could create an e-binder. So then basically they're taking redacted source and providing it in an electronic fashion that can then be logged in and accessed in a secure way. Some sites chose to move forward with providing us with redacted source documents. So basically they were either going through their EMR or their paper records, however they kept source, making sure it was all redacted and then providing it to us. And a lot of times just providing it to us, through email. The information they're providing us is fully redacted. So we have them redacted down to pretty much just using a subject number. So no identifiable information coming through in redacted source. And then we have a small group of sites, at least in the sites that I'm working with. I've heard from other colleagues and other people in the industry that cloud-based solutions is actually becoming quite popular, that this is a way that a lot of sites are turning to providing their source. We haven't quite so much have had sites that have used the cloud-based solutions, but I know that that's commonly happening in industry right now. And the next site-specific variable, as I've mentioned, is the access to the essential documents or the investigator site file. Okay, so ideally, what's gone the best, and a lot more sites are using Florence, I feel like now than in the last 5 years. More commonly when we are qualifying a site or conducting the SIV, they're letting us know, well, no, we're actually maintaining our investigator site file electronically, and we're using Florence or a system that's similar to that. So that's been really beneficial because we can access Florence. The site will give us a login, excuse me, a login name and a password, and we can go in and view their electronic site files. Similarly, what sites have done with Source using an e-binder, some sites have chosen to do that as well with their investigator site files. And then some sites are just using an electronic investigational site file through a different type of technology or platform. And then there are sites that aren't doing any of that. So there are still sites that are maintaining paper investigational site files, and that's fine. We're working with them, we're confirming with them, we know what they're supposed to have, we're asking them to confirm that they still, they have their current IRB approval, they have their IND safety letters on file. It's quite easy to go through and do, have a conversation and talk about, what we expect to be there and asking them to confirm. You could probably also we haven't done this, but you could do a screen share. So especially if a site's maintaining a paper binder, there's no reason why you couldn't screen share and have them go through the paper binder and show you what they're maintaining. And then staffing. So staffing has kind of ebbed and flowed. So this was a really important variable to take into consideration because we quickly learned that our staff were being allocated and moved to help with different things within their institution, depending upon whether they were an RN, a study coordinator who was an RN. So depending upon their role and their title, people were being pulled maybe out of sort of their clinical research role to assist with COVID-19 related protocols that were being put in place at the institutions that they worked at. Another piece we found is for the staff that wasn't necessarily an RN or someone who was going to be helping with a COVID-related protocol. And when we say protocol, I mean their institution's protocol, not a study protocol. These institutions shifted basically into ways of keeping patients safe and how patients were coming through the hospital. And they needed extra staff to help coordinate all of that. So we did lose some staff to those types of things. And then we had staff that went remote. So we had, that, and for that also presented challenges because for some people, they had less access to what we would need, especially if they were going to be providing redacted source. We had some study coordinators who were maybe going into the office twice a week, and then those were the days that they could focus on providing us with redacted source, but maybe Monday, Wednesday, Friday, they couldn't because they were in their home office. I mentioned staff allocated to assist with COVID-19 care. And then another piece, a staffing piece, was access to PPE. So different studies were probably affected by this depending upon what the assessments looked like. I currently work on a study where access to PPE was actually important for one of the assessments that needed to be done. So that was another thing to consider, is kind of the impact on your protocol and the assessments for your protocol. Are you going to have assessments that can't be done, or at least can't be done for a period of time because access to PPE has been limited? And then the budget piece. So again, I talked about one of the cons is it's usually a lot of additional work or some additional work for the sites to accommodate remote monitoring. And if you didn't have remote monitoring built in from the beginning, your chances are the budget that the site had negotiated for the study wasn't set up to accommodate some of that extra work. So there is often a revisit to the original study budget that was negotiated to help make accommodations for the remote monitoring, for the staffing, and those types of things. So again, that's another site-specific variable. Some sites came to us and asked for a budget modification, and some sites haven't. But it's definitely a piece to keep in mind, especially if a site is really challenging. It may be helpful to open that. That might be one of the solutions, is to open a dialogue about, well, what if we can, modify the budget so that you can do X, Y, or Z. Okay. So most importantly, what we always do as monitors and those that are running trials is we're always looking to provide adequate oversight and to ensure patient safety and trial integrity. Okay. Those are all things that we have to do, whether we're doing them on site or remotely. Okay. So it was important to figure out some of these things are more easily done on site, but we can't just not do them because we're remote. So it was really important to sort of brainstorm, be creative, talk with colleagues and say, hey, how can we do this? We're going to need to continue to review informed consent forms. How can we do that remotely? How can we make sure that we're doing it, that we're still ensuring patient safety? Privacy. Okay, so privacy is obviously a big piece. We need to maintain, confidentiality for our study, for the patients that are enrolled in the study. FDA guidance. So it was really helpful. The FDA did come out with guidance for us pretty early on. I think the first guidance document did come out in March, and the FDA has moved forward with revising it as needed, which has also been helpful for all of us navigating. So the FDA guidance, again, is another important piece for, how does the FDA see us doing this? How are we going to continue to provide oversight to ensure patient safety and trial integrity? And then the last thing I left here, I believe this is the last slide, is that concept of documenting. So document. I feel like as a monitor, we commonly use that with our sites. If it wasn't documented, it wasn't done. So it's very much a source related sort of phrase, document, but it's also just really important for all of us working on the study, and that, we're documenting what we're doing. We're documenting how we're doing it. We are reviewing ICFs remotely, but how are we doing it? All of that information is very important to have documented. So again, it just shows what happened in the trial, what happened over the course of the trial. In the event of an audit, somebody can come back and say, okay, this is what they did. They pivoted to remote monitoring. This is how they reviewed ICFs. This is how they conducted drug accountability. This is how they, each piece. So just keep that in mind, that the documentation is always important, but definitely I feel like even more important when you pivot and start doing things a little bit differently. Okay, so thank you for listening in to that part of our webinar. I'm going to turn it back over to Chris.
Great, Amy. Thanks so much for that great presentation. Really appreciate it. So we have a bunch of questions that have popped up from the attendees. So I thought maybe we could go through, Amy and I can go through some of those questions and address them. And obviously, if there are other questions that came up, please feel free to enter those into the chat as we're talking. So we have about 30 minutes or so to talk through some of these questions. So Amy, one of the first questions that popped up are what technological considerations should companies keep in mind as they look towards their remote trial? I know that at Alira we're managing multiple trials. We started up some trials during COVID. We kept some trials ongoing. So what are our thoughts in terms of maybe some of the good pieces of technologies we've seen? What have you experienced on the monitoring side? And maybe I can speak to some of the technical components, but is there anything that's worked well for you guys in terms of tech or not so well?
Well, I mean, I just think anything that really provides remote access is what has worked well. Definitely not everything is perfect. So when we go to log into an EMR system, for example, for the first time, sometimes there's definitely a lag time between when we try to get in and when we actually get in. So sometimes it's not initially easy, but it varies across sites, but usually they have somebody in IT that's available. I think if you're setting up a study, I think one thing to think about is there the potential, like if you're starting a study now and you know that obviously COVID is going to be a thing, do you want to be asking these questions up front to your sites? Are you using any of these platforms? It may be helpful to kind of have a list of what is commonly used so that you can ask a site. You can ask a site, are you using Florence by chance? How are you collecting your source? Are you using an EMR system? If you are, which EMR system are you using? Does that EMR system provide access? So basically, as you are identifying and bringing sites on, if you kind of focus on some of these different technologies and finding out if your sites have them, it's going to make that process that much smoother from a remote monitoring standpoint. So you may not have to have all of your sites that are fully operating in this sort of remote world using all of this technology, but it may make sense to have a majority of your sites working that way. The good news is I think most sites are now transitioning. So if they already weren't using some of these platforms, they're now trying to use these platforms. And we've seen that with our own studies that we're working on, is we've had sites that really had limited remote monitoring capabilities in March, but in July, August, and even now, that's completely changed and shifted. So I think that's another good piece, is I think a site can get relatively quick access and training and be able to bring up and use these technologies that are becoming available.
I think you made a great point too, is when we were talking about at the outset, having a list of questions for the sites when you're selecting them and making sure that I know at Alira, we always recommend a really robust feasibility assessment of all of the sites before we start any trial. But I think what we've started doing too is making sure that we include COVID-19 specific questions in that feasibility assessment, and then really digging into, what are your procedures, even, patient population wise, what are you seeing? But on the technical side, how are you, like you said, how are you going to provide us access? What's the process? Have you developed an SOP around, allowing us to have access to your data and being really specific in the feasibility process?
Yeah, I think, even to go along with that is you can go as far as with staffing. What does your staffing look like with COVID-19? Have you had to shift people, and what effect has that had? Because I feel like right now COVID is kind of in a flux, where we did see things were picking back up probably, I don't know, May, June, July, and August, but now we're starting to see the sites kind of get pulled a little bit, especially if they're in a hospital, where these hospitals are really getting busy with COVID patients. So then the staff is kind of getting split and maybe isn't quite as readily available to focus on our study. So maybe things are taking a little bit longer to get done from a study standpoint because the staff has been allocated. So that may be a helpful question. How does your study staff work? Would we see them get diverted, or would you have a team that would primarily be focused on the study?
That's a great point. It's actually a perfect segue into another question that we had. So, which was, especially for companies who are a Scottish company or company who's not located in the US, what are some of the challenges we've seen, dealing with staffing at the hospitals, and maybe whether it's a challenge with a study coordinator or a research nurse? Like, what are some of the challenges we've seen with COVID-19, especially since they're not here in the States, to be close to the hospital? What are some of the things we've been dealing with in terms of these trials?
Yeah, I think the biggest piece is kind of the staffing piece. So once the essential employee piece happened, that not only meant us as not essential employees, but I think some of our study staff who are more just trained study coordinators and aren't RNs or LPNs or have a nursing degree, they were kind of sent home to work from home. So and that's okay. It was great that they were still working from home, but then that sort of did also limit the work that they could do. And then if they're sent home, are they going to be able to, what is the likelihood of them still being able to see patients? Do we have patients that are currently on trial that need to be seen? How often do they need to be seen? Who's available to see them? I think there were definitely some situations where I don't think anybody really kind of dropped their study responsibilities, but there was definitely an appropriate shift. So maybe being aware and being prepared for maybe how it could affect your study timelines. I think we also had to look at, patient enrollment maybe slowing during that time when the COVID numbers were going up and staff was being allocated to focus on COVID-19 related responsibilities. But I think there was kind of a natural decrease in patients coming on study as well. But that's going to differ across the indication. So some studies are going to continue to enroll no matter what's going on. And some studies may see a decrease, especially if it's kind of a non-essential type of an appointment where maybe they can go some time without having to come in. So that's something to think about too, is the type of trial that you're running and the type of patients that you're recruiting.
That's true. I was thinking a couple examples even internally at Alira, but I mean, I can think of one where it's an elective procedure, and you might anticipate that the number of patients coming in for an elective procedure is going to drop significantly versus maybe an oncology treatment trial where these patients are still coming in for their chemotherapy or their radiation therapy. And I think that's really relevant now because we are seeing another surge of cases here in the US. Obviously, everyone's following the Pfizer vaccine day by day and other developments. Probably a whole nother webinar. But I think that it's also important to be realistic as a sponsor company if you're considering planning a trial here, understanding that like you said, depending on the indication, you may need to account for research staff being pulled in other directions, for the patient population to be a bit decreased. Not that it's not possible, maybe that will affect your study timelines in terms of a reduced enrollment rate, and then the ability to monitor that data. Yeah. All right, let's see. We're having a couple more questions here in the list. So this one, maybe I can start as an answer. Maybe Amy, you can jump into. But can you provide advice on selecting a partner or CRO in the U.S. in this environment? What should companies be looking for to ensure a successful remote trial? I mean, I think on my side of things, because I work with a lot of early companies and companies that are trying to strategize around choosing partners, especially cross geographies. I think it's important to understand that, like Amy mentioned, the previous experience in dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic in the research environment. I think it's important to understand the capabilities of the CRO and your partner organizations. What technologies are they using? What are they able to work with? But I think even more important than the technology is really what relationships they have with the sites, how they've proven their ability to keep monitoring going with the clinical trial sites. An organization have a great piece of technology, but if hasn't been well adopted by the sites, if they're not able to utilize in an efficient manner during the trial, then a great piece of technology is worthless if it's not implemented effectively. So I would say really carefully analyze what the previous experience of your partners has been in the US in terms of COVID-19 research during the COVID-19 pandemic, and then assess and analyze and work collaboratively with a partner to figure out the best way to implement the trial. And I think I would also say make sure that you have a realistic expectation. You may have been working with a timeline in your head pre-COVID-19 as you're doing your preclinical and your planning. And some of those timelines will certainly need to be adjusted based on reduced enrollment rates, based on the ability to monitor the data, maybe a different frequency than you were anticipating. So I would say be realistic too, and work with your partners here in the States to make sure you have a realistic timeline and expectations. Amy, anything to add in terms of CRO partners or choosing partners?
I would think if you're evaluating a few different CRO partners and you're having conversations with them, I think it would be important to ask them, how did you navigate, COVID-19, and how did you help your partners navigate, and what contribution did you make, or what ideas did you bring to the table? I think it would be really helpful to have them share some examples or share some successes they've had. They certainly, if they work with a lot of different companies and work on a lot of different studies, they should be able to speak to what they did and how they did it and how they kept things moving and kept things going.
That's a great point. We had another question, which was how have costs possibly changed in the US for trials, like trial budgets and things like that? And maybe I can start off with an answer there. I think that overall, we found, for a lot of the studies that we've been running, there have been small tweaks here and there that we've been making to trial budgets, especially as it relates to remote monitoring. So, for example, we've had certain hospitals in the U.S. which have applied, a flat increase. Some applied a percentage increase to the overall study budget, basically to account for the additional support that's needed to do remote monitoring, so that the study coordinators can upload that information or allow us to access that information remotely. For other sites, they've added additional coordinator time. As Amy talked about, there is an additional burden on the sites, especially for some of the sites that weren't well set up previously, to be able to implement these systems to allow the coordinators to work more closely with our remote monitors. So we've seen that, some of the study budgets have increased. I would say it hasn't been a massive increase in the study budgets. And we really try to take it on a case by case basis. So we always encourage our sponsor companies that we work with to be flexible and be willing to offer the additional financial support to the sites as needed. But I think at the same time, in a research environment, part of the obligation of a site is to, if they want to participate in research during COVID-19, to provide the support and to fulfill their obligations, their contractual obligations to a sponsor company. So we're not necessarily funding all of this new staff at the sites. We may be able to help out through the study budget, but I think it's important to also understand that the site still does have that obligation to be able to provide access, per GCP to this information.
Yeah.
Amy, any thoughts there? I know we've been working on a couple of budget changes with some of our sites.
Definitely. I was just going to say that then there's also the monitoring piece where none of us are traveling right now. So there's no airfare. We're not submitting monthly expense reports right now. No one's paying for us to be in the air, to be in a hotel, to have a rental car. So I haven't really drilled down on that to see what that offset is, but there are some savings with that piece. That's
actually a great point. I was just looking at a budget the other day where it was actually a fairly large reduction in the overall study budget because of all of the travel being canceled out and everything done remotely. So, that's obviously especially for a smaller biotech, a startup company where every dollar really matters at that early phase. That's important to factor in as well. And maybe a company too could consider taking some of that and maybe investing some of those savings into, a more efficient remote monitoring system or a system for uploading of source documentation. So that's good. I was thinking only the increases in research costs because of COVID, but that's true. That's a decrease, which is always nice.
Right. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. I think we have, this is a general question that came in, but what lessons have we learned about remote monitoring this year during COVID? I think, Amy, you touched on a lot of them, but any, sort of major overall lessons or anything that you've seen, or maybe a shift in the industry or things that you're predicting?
Well, I think I feel like it's important to really just consider the sites. It's really a site kind of to site experience. You can bucket the sites. So, you may have a study with 100 sites and you maybe know that 25 of them, give EMR access and are using a Florence binder. So it's really that initial, especially if you're transitioning. So if this was a study that was running before COVID, now you're running in COVID, that site communication and understanding the site and how the site is set up, what they can do, what maybe their limitations are, what is their staffing going to look like, and then really working closely with maybe the sites that have the most barriers to come up with ways to help them be successful. I feel like that was kind of a lessons learned in terms of the overall site specificity of it all and understanding each site and then kind of grouping the sites. And I don't even know if I can quantify maybe the number of scenarios there were. I don't know, do we have 6 different site scenarios? And then I would say, that was probably, I think the other lesson learned would be that it can be done. I think there's always sort of been this interest in doing it and this interest in wanting to do it, but then some resistance. But really the resistance got naturally removed. Like we had to do it this way and we had to move forward with it. So I think it's been nice to see that, it can be done. Did we have to think creatively in some places, in some areas? Yes, but I think that's natural. We're kind of redesigning a process and doing it differently. So that's
awesome.
What I did.
I agree. I think for me, not to get too philosophical, but I think that there's, obviously within research, the ultimate goal is helping people. So I think that it has been a challenge to, sort of missing that human connection in terms of the
Mhm.
on-site visits with monitoring and connecting with the physicians, with the research teams. So I think for me, I see us moving into more of a hybrid model down the road, even when we are able to
Mhm.
travel again, more of a hybrid approach. So some remote visits, but also maintaining some on-site visits to keep that connection. I think sometimes, and especially with certain teams and certain types of trials, there's no substitute for the face-to-face
Right.
communication with these research teams. But I think
Mhm.
having the chance and the technology now in place to be able to perform effective remote visits is super helpful. There's a financial implication that, cost savings, there's also an efficiency now. So I have a feeling that, we're going to see much more of a hybrid approach for a lot of these trials and maybe a fully remote model for certain indications where it just makes sense. But
Yeah,
I think it's
depending
exciting
upon
what's happening now. Yeah.
yeah, I think depending upon the phase of the trial. So obviously there are
Mhm.
different aspects of, and that's kind of how we've always looked at it previously is, what type of trial is it? Is it phase 4? So, certain studies have had remote monitoring and risk-based monitoring, with the risk-based monitoring basically saying we're going to go on site when this happens, and then primarily working remotely. But I think that this has shown us that I think more studies or more indications are potentially adaptable to more of a hybrid model where really we can do some on-site and we can do some remote and be successful.
I absolutely agree. Well, it looks like we've reached the end of our Q&A session, the end of our questions. So I think that will probably wrap us up a little bit or a few minutes early for today. But again, Amy, want to thank you for presenting today and for providing your insights. Again, we want to thank SDI for hosting this webinar with us, and we really appreciate everyone's attendance. Just wanted to mention too, you have my contact information at the bottom left of the slide that's up on the screen currently. So if for the attendees, if there are any questions, anything we can do to assist, please do feel free to reach out directly following the webinar. And again, just wanted to thank everyone and have a great day.
Thank you.